I had attended briefings with generals before. None of them had ever made my hands shake. The moment the 4-star general rested his hand on the conference table, I stopped hearing a single word in the room. My eyes were locked on the silver ring around his finger. It wasn't merely similar to the one my father had worn every day of his life. It was identical, the same brushed silver, the same worn edges, the same strange geometric engraving that twisted around the band like a puzzle no jeweler had ever been able to identify. My father had been dead for 23 years. I had buried him with that ring, or at least that's what I'd believed. When the meeting ended, I walked straight toward the most powerful man in the building and asked a question that changed both our lives forever. "Sir, where did you get that ring?" He looked at me for only a second before all the color disappeared from his face. Then he whispered, "Tell me your father's name." My name is Melissa Grant, and for most of my life I believed my father had died, leaving behind only memories, a folded American flag, and a handful of unanswered questions. I was a major in the United States Army stationed at Fort Liberty. At 32, I had learned to separate emotions from decisions. The Army teaches you that very early. You complete the mission. You protect the people beside you. You carry the weight quietly. Most days I succeeded, but every year on October 17th, I drove to a quiet cemetery outside Raleigh with a bouquet of white lilies and spent an hour talking to a man who had never answered me back. Colonel Daniel Grant had died when I was 9 years old. At least that's all my mother ever told me. He had served with honor. He had loved us more than anything. His death had been ruled service-related, but most of his records remained sealed. Whenever I asked questions, my mother would smile sadly and brush a strand of hair behind my ear. "Your father was a good man, Melissa." That was always where the conversation ended. No stories about his deployments. No stories about his closest friends. No stories about the years before I was born. As I grew older, I stopped asking. I convinced myself that some doors stayed closed for a reason. Still, one object always fascinated me. His ring. It wasn't a wedding band. My mother still wore her own gold wedding ring on a chain around her neck, but my father's silver ring rested inside a small walnut box in the top drawer of her dresser. Every birthday she allowed me to hold it for a few minutes before carefully putting it away again. "It belonged to your father long before he met me," she once told me. "He never took it off." I had asked where he'd gotten it. She simply shook her head. "I honestly don't know." The engraving looked almost handmade. Sharp lines intersected one another in a pattern that reminded me of old military maps. Years later, while traveling for training, I'd shown photographs of it to jewelers in North Carolina, Virginia, Texas, even Germany. Every one of them had given me the same answer. "I've never seen anything like it." Eventually, life moved forward. Military schools, officer candidate school, deployments, promotions. My mother passed away 3 years earlier after a quiet battle with pancreatic cancer, taking many of my unanswered questions with her. Now all I had left was the ring. I kept it locked in my apartment, wrapped in the same faded handkerchief my father had once carried. The morning everything changed began like every other Tuesday. The installation buzzed with unusual energy. Soldiers hurried across headquarters carrying briefing folders. Staff officers rehearsed presentations under their breath. Coffee disappeared faster than anyone could brew it. A 4-star general was visiting, General Thomas Whitaker. His reputation filled every room before he ever entered one. He had commanded overseas advised presidents and appeared on magazine covers. Younger officers admired him. Senior officers respected him. No one wanted to disappoint him. Our division commander reminded everyone to remain professional. As far as General Whitaker is concerned, he said every detail matters. By 9:30, the conference room looked spotless. Flags perfectly aligned. Projector tested twice. Nameplates centered exactly where protocol required. I took my seat halfway down the long table, opened my notebook, and reviewed the logistics report one last time. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doors opened. Everyone stood. General Whitaker entered with 3 aides and exchanged quiet greetings before taking the seat at the head of the table. He looked older than I expected, somewhere in his early 60s. Broad shoulders despite the years, silver hair cut short, calm blue eyes that seemed to notice everything without appearing to search. He thanked us for our work before the briefing began. For nearly 20 minutes I focused entirely on the discussion. Personnel readiness, equipment modernization, training rotations. Then he reached for a glass of water. His right hand moved into the sunlight streaming through the conference room windows. The silver band caught the light. Time stopped. Every sound became distant. The projector. Pages turning. Someone clearing his throat. None of it reached me anymore. I stared at the ring. The engraving. The scratches. Even the tiny nick near one edge. Impossible. My father had worn that ring every day. I had held it hundreds of times. I knew every mark. Every imperfection. My pulse hammered against my collar. No, it couldn't be. Maybe another craftsman had copied the design decades ago. Maybe it only looked identical. I tried to concentrate again, but I couldn't remember a single sentence spoken during the remaining 40 minutes. One question echoed inside my head. How? The meeting finally ended. Chairs scraped across the floor. Officers gathered binders. General Whitaker thanked everyone before walking toward the hallway with his staff. I should have let it go. Any reasonable officer would have. Instead, I heard my father's voice somewhere deep in my memory. Never ignore the truth because it's inconvenient. Before I realized what I was doing, I was already walking after him. General Whitaker. He turned. His aides paused several steps behind him. Yes, Major. I swallowed. My mouth had suddenly gone dry. Sir, may I ask you something personal? His expression remained polite. You may. I looked directly at the ring. Where did you get that? He followed my eyes. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the blood drained from his face. His shoulders stiffened. Very slowly, he looked back at me. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. Major, what was your father's name? For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. The hallway outside the conference room buzzed with quiet conversations as officers carried folders toward their next meetings, completely unaware that the 4-star general standing in front of me looked as though someone had just reached into his past and pulled out a ghost. My father's name was Colonel Daniel Grant, I repeated. General Whitaker lowered his eyes. He slowly removed the silver ring from his finger and turned it over in his palm. His thumb traced the engraved pattern with the familiarity of someone who had done it thousands of times. I never imagined I'd hear that name again, he said softly. One of his aides stepped closer. Sir, your transportation is waiting. Whitaker didn't even look at him. Cancel it. The aide blinked in surprise. Sir. I said cancel it. Without another word, the aide nodded and walked away. The general looked back at me. Major Grant, would you mind walking with me? Normally, that question wouldn't have required a second thought. But something in his voice wasn't military. It wasn't the tone of a superior officer giving an instruction. It sounded like an old man carrying a burden that had become too heavy to bear. We walked in silence through a quieter corridor until we reached a small conference room overlooking the parade field. The room was empty except for a long oak table and 2 leather chairs. Whitaker closed the door himself. For several moments, he simply stood beside the window. Outside, soldiers marched across the training field in perfect formation. Boots struck pavement with mechanical precision. Finally, he spoke. Tell me something first. I nodded. Did your mother ever tell you about a man named Thomas Whitaker? I searched my memory. Nothing. No, sir? He gave a sad smile. I didn't think she would. He reached inside his briefcase and removed an old brown envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, its corners softened by decades of handling. I've carried this with me for 24 years. My heartbeat quickened. He carefully opened the envelope and slid a photograph across the table. I froze. It wasn't just a picture of my father. It was a picture of my father laughing. I had never seen him laugh before. Every photograph my mother kept showed him standing stiffly in uniform or holding me as a baby. But this was different. He looked younger, more relaxed. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows. He had grease on one hand. Standing beside him with one arm over his shoulder was a much younger Thomas Whitaker. Neither of them wore dress uniforms. Neither of them looked like decorated officers. They looked like 2 friends who had forgotten the camera was there. And on both of their right hands, the rings. Exactly the same. I carefully picked up the photograph. When was this taken? 1998, 2 years before he died. Whitaker nodded. He insisted we stop for barbecue after a field exercise. Said nobody made brisket better than a little place outside Fort Hood. A faint laugh escaped him. I complained the entire drive. His smile faded almost immediately. He told me one day I'd miss those afternoons. His eyes drifted toward the parade field. He was right. I stared at the photograph. This wasn't the father I remembered. This wasn't even the father I knew. He looked alive, confident, happy. My mother never showed me this. There are many things she never saw herself. I looked up. What does that mean? Whitaker hesitated. Then he slowly reached into the envelope again. This time he removed several folded documents secured with a faded green ribbon. They were returned to me after your father's memorial service. I noticed the army seal stamped across the first page. My pulse quickened again. Are those his service records? No. What are they? They're letters. My eyes widened. My father wrote letters. He wasn't much of a writer. Whitaker smiled sadly. But every time we were deployed, he'd write one. He paused. Not because he expected to die, because he believed every soldier should leave behind words that mattered. I reached toward the stack but stopped halfway. I've never seen these. I know. Why? His shoulders seemed to sink under an invisible weight. Because I made a promise. A promise? Daniel told me something before our final deployment together. Whitaker looked directly into my eyes. If anything happens to me, he said, don't bring these to my family until my daughter has chosen her own path. I frowned. I don't understand. He didn't want you growing up in his shadow. The room became impossibly quiet. He wanted you to become whoever you chose to become. Whitaker continued. He said if you became a teacher, you'd be a wonderful teacher. If you became a doctor, you'd heal people. If you became an artist, you'd create beauty. And if you chose the army, he smiled for the first time since we'd met. Then you'd understand the weight carried inside these pages. A lump formed in my throat. So you've been waiting all these years? I have. You knew where I was. He slowly shook his head. Not always. I lost track of your family after your mother moved. I searched more than once. I contacted old addresses. I even asked mutual friends. But your mother had every right to protect her privacy. He folded his hands together. When I received the invitation list for today's briefing and saw the name Major Melissa Grant, I wondered if it could possibly be you. Then you walked into that room. And when I saw your face, he couldn't finish the sentence. Neither could I. For the first time since I was 9 years old, someone sitting across from me wasn't talking about Colonel Daniel Grant. He was talking about Daniel, a friend, a mentor, a man who laughed over barbecue and worried about his daughter's future. Someone real. Whitaker slid the bundle of letters toward me but kept one hand resting gently on top. I can give these to you now. I looked down at them. 24 years of silence sat between us on that table. What made you decide today was the right time? His answer came without hesitation. You stood in front of a 4-star general, risked embarrassing yourself, and asked a question because you wanted the truth. He smiled warmly. That is exactly what your father would have done. I looked at the weathered envelope, then back at the photograph of 2 young officers smiling into a future neither of them could possibly have imagined. For the first time in decades, I realized I wasn't about to learn how my father died. I was finally going to learn how he lived. I did not open the letters in front of General Whitaker. I wanted to. My fingers were already resting on the faded ribbon, feeling the thin ridge where time had worn down the fabric. But something inside me knew those words deserved a quieter place than a military conference room with fluorescent lights and a parade field outside the window. General Whitaker seemed to understand. He did not rush me. He only gathered the photograph, slid it gently back into the envelope, then stopped and looked at it one more time before handing everything to me. Take your time with them, he said. I nodded, but my throat was too tight to answer. He walked me back toward the main hallway himself. It was strange watching soldiers step aside for him, watching colonels and command sergeants major straighten as he passed, while I held an old envelope against my chest, like it was something fragile enough to break if I breathed too hard. Before we reached the lobby, he stopped. Major Grant. Yes, sir. His face had settled back into control, but his eyes still carried the weight of everything we had spoken about. There is one letter in there you should read last. I looked down at the envelope. Which one? You'll know. That was all he said. The rest of the day passed in pieces. I signed forms I couldn't remember reading. I answered questions I barely heard. At one point, Captain Ellis from operations asked if I was feeling all right, and I told him I hadn't slept well. It wasn't a lie exactly. It just wasn't the truth. By 6:30 that evening, I was sitting alone in my apartment with the envelope on my kitchen table. My apartment was small, neat, and quiet. Too quiet. A framed photo of my mother sat on the bookshelf beside my commissioning certificate. My father's folded flag rested in a shadow box across the room. Beneath it, in a walnut box, was the silver ring I had known all my life. I took it out first. The ring was cool in my palm. Then I placed General Whitaker's photograph beside it. 2 young officers smiled up at me from another century. My father stood with one arm thrown around Thomas Whitaker's shoulder, his head tilted slightly back, laughing at something beyond the camera. He looked nothing like the solemn man in the photos my mother had kept. He looked like someone people wanted to be near. I sat there for a long time before opening the first letter. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Blocky, careful, a little slanted to the right. Dear Melissa, if you are reading this someday, it means someone finally decided you were old enough to hear from a man who loved you more than he knew how to say. I stopped breathing for a second. Not because the sentence was dramatic, because it sounded like him. Not the version I had built from photographs and family silence, but the father I almost remembered. The man who had once tied my shoes on the front porch and told me not to be ashamed of falling down as long as I got back up. I kept reading. He wrote about ordinary things first. Pancakes on Saturday mornings, the way I used to line up my stuffed animals by rank after he showed me how soldiers stood in formation. How I had once saluted the mailman because I thought every man in uniform deserved respect. I laughed once suddenly and softly. Then I pressed my fingers against my mouth because the laugh had hurt. The next letter was from a deployment. He told me the desert looked different at night. Not empty exactly, but watchful. He said soldiers learned to miss small things. A screen door closing, a dog barking in the distance, the smell of rain on pavement. He wrote that when he missed home too much, he would close his eyes and picture me asleep with one hand curled under my cheek. I read 4 letters before I cried. Not loudly. Not the way people cry in movies. The tears simply began falling onto the paper and I had to move the letter away so I wouldn't stain the ink. Then I found the one General Whitaker must have meant. It was folded separately. No date, no location, only my name on the outside. Melissa. My hands began to tremble before I opened it. My dear girl, there are things a father wants to teach his child in person. How to drive, how to check the oil in a car, how to know when a person is telling the truth, how to stand still when the world is trying to push you over. If I do not get to teach you those things, I hope life sends you good people who will. I swallowed hard. The room blurred. He continued, I need you to know something about Thomas Whitaker. If this letter has reached you, it is likely because he kept his word. Thomas is not perfect. None of us are. But he is the kind of man who will walk through fire for a promise. Years ago, he and I made a foolish young soldier's pact over 2 silver rings. We were tired, scared, and too proud to admit either thing. We promised that if one of us didn't make it home, the other would help carry what was left behind. I looked at my father's ring. The silver band seemed heavier now. He wrote that the rings had been made by an old metalworker near a training post in Germany. Not expensive, not ceremonial, just 2 bands engraved with a pattern the old man called the Road Home. My father had worn Thomas's ring. Thomas had worn his. A trade, a promise, a way of saying neither man would ever face the dark alone again. Then came the sentence that made me put the letter down. If your mother keeps Sam away, do not blame her. I stared at those words for a long time. My first instinct was anger. Old anger, new anger, all of it rising at once. My mother had known enough to keep his letters. She had known General Whitaker existed. She had known there was someone who might have told me who my father really was, and she had said nothing. But then I looked at her photograph across the room. She looked tired even in that picture. Beautiful, but tired. A woman who had buried her husband, raised a child, paid bills, moved homes, smiled at school plays, and never once let me see how close she was to breaking. I picked up the letter again. Grief can make good people build walls they later don't know how to tear down. Your mother loves deeply. That means she hurts deeply too. Be gentle with her memory if you can. That was when I finally understood the difference between silence and cruelty. My mother had not erased my father because she didn't care. She had locked away the parts of him she could not survive touching. I sat at that kitchen table until the sky outside turned black. When my phone rang, I nearly jumped. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. Major Grant. A pause. Then General Whitaker's voice. Melissa. It was the first time he had used my first name. Yes, sir. I apologize for calling so late. I looked at the letters spread across my table, my father's life laid out in ink and paper. It's all right. Another pause. Did you read them? Yes. All of them. I looked down at the final letter. Yes. His voice lowered. Then there is something else you need to know. A cold stillness moved through me. What? General Whitaker took a slow breath. Your father's death was not an accident." General Whitaker's words hung in the air like smoke after a muzzle flash. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles whitening. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in as the weight of 23 years pressed down on my chest. "What do you mean it wasn't an accident?" My voice came out steadier than I expected, the product of years of army training. He exhaled slowly on the other end. "Not over the phone, Melissa. Some truths need to be faced in person. Can you meet me tomorrow morning at the old memorial garden behind headquarters?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." Sleep was impossible that night. I reread every letter from my father until the words blurred. The silver ring sat on the table beside them, catching the lamplight like a silent witness. By dawn, I was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple sweater, feeling strangely vulnerable without my uniform. The memorial garden was quiet when I arrived. General Whitaker was already there, sitting on a stone bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. He looked older in the soft morning light, the lines on his face deeper. A small wooden box rested on his lap. He stood as I approached. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for me to sit. We sat in silence for a moment, the distant sound of morning PT echoing faintly across the base. Birds called overhead. Finally, he placed the box between us. "Your father asked me to give you this when the time was right. I've carried it for years, waiting." My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside lay 3 items: a small leather-bound journal, a worn unit insignia badge I didn't recognize, and a single envelope addressed to me in my father's familiar, blocky handwriting. I picked up the letter first, the paper fragile with age. The seal had never been broken. "Melissa, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home from this last mission. There are no easy words for a father to write to his little girl knowing he might never see her grow up. But I need you to know this more than anything. I'm not writing about war or glory. Those things don't matter in the end. I'm writing about you and your mother, about the life I dreamed for us every night I was away. I remember the way you'd run to the door when I came home on leave, your small arms wrapping around my leg like you'd never let go. I remember your laugh. God, that laugh could light up the darkest desert night. You have your mother's strength and my stubbornness, and that combination is going to take you far. Be kind, Melissa. Be honest. Stand up for what's right even when it's hard. The world needs more people like that. And never be afraid to love deeply even if it hurts. That's how we know we're truly alive. If I'm gone, please don't let grief define you. Live boldly. Chase the things that make your heart race. I'll be watching from somewhere prouder than any man has a right to be. To my friend Sam, if these words reach you too, thank you. You kept your promise. You always did. The ring was never just metal. It was our bond. Take care of my girls the way I would have. And tell Melissa her old man never stopped thinking about her. Not for 1 second. I love you both more than words can hold. Dad. Tears streamed down my face before I reached the end. I hadn't cried like this since I was a child, deep wrenching sobs that shook my shoulders. The father I had known only in fragments was suddenly whole. He hadn't been a distant hero or a sealed file. He had been a man who loved pancakes on Saturdays and worried about his daughter's future. General Whitaker placed a steady hand on my shoulder, saying nothing until the worst of it passed. "I failed him," he said quietly, his voice thick. "For over 20 years I tried to find you both. Your mother moved several times. She wanted to protect you from this world, from the pain. I respected that, but every missed birthday, every holiday, I felt like I had broken the only promise that ever truly mattered." I wiped my eyes and looked at him. This powerful 4-star general, a man who had commanded armies, sat with tears in his eyes. "You didn't fail him, sir. You're here now. You kept trying. That's what matters." He gave a small, grateful nod and reached into the box, pulling out the journal. Together we flipped through its pages. It was filled with sketches, short notes, and photographs I had never seen. My father as a young lieutenant laughing with comrades. One photo showed him and Whitaker arms around each other's shoulders, both wearing the rings, standing in front of a Humvee somewhere dusty and sun-baked. For the next hour, Whitaker told stories I had hungered for my entire life. The time my father had carried a wounded soldier 3 miles through enemy territory. How he refused a medal because bringing everyone home was enough. The silly pranks they pulled to keep morale up during long deployments. The way he spoke about me constantly showing anyone who would listen photos of his daughter. I traced the geometric engraving on the ring with my thumb, feeling the connection across decades. He saved my life more than once, Whitaker said. But more than that, he taught me what real honor looks like. Not the kind they pin on your chest, the quiet kind, the kind that keeps promises even after death. As the sun climbed higher, we sat surrounded by memories. For the first time, the hole my father left didn't feel quite so empty. It felt filled with something warm and enduring. I closed the journal gently and looked at the man who had kept my father's final wishes. "Thank you," I whispered, "for everything." Months had slipped by since that morning in the memorial garden, yet the weight of discovery still lingered in quiet moments. I had read my father's letters until the pages felt like old friends. The small leather journal traveled with me on every assignment, its entries a compass when the path ahead seemed uncertain. General Whitaker and I spoke often now, not as a 4-star officer and a major, but as two people bound by the same promise across time. He had become the bridge to a father I was only now learning to know. The invitation to speak at the annual memorial service for fallen soldiers arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon. It was to be held at the base's main auditorium, a solemn gathering of families, active duty personnel, and veterans. I accepted without hesitation. For the first time I felt ready to speak, not just about loss, but about what remains. The hall was filled to capacity on the appointed evening. Rows of uniforms stretched back under soft lighting flags, hanging reverently along the walls. The air carried the faint scent of polished brass and fresh flowers. I sat near the front, my hands folded tightly in my lap, heart steady but full. No one had mentioned General Whitaker's attendance. He had insisted on staying in the background, preferring the focus remain on the fallen. When my name was called, I rose and walked to the podium. The microphone felt cool beneath my fingers. For a moment I looked out at the sea of faces, some young, some etched with years of service, and felt the presence of every story woven into this room. I stand here not as Major Melissa Grant. I began my voice calm and clear, but as the daughter of Colonel Daniel Grant. For most of my life I knew him only through silence and a silver ring. Today I understand he left behind far more. I spoke of the ordinary moments he had written about, the pancakes, the laughter, the quiet fears he carried so we wouldn't have to. I shared how his words had taught me that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving forward anyway. The audience listened in attentive silence, many nodding with recognition. As I finished and stepped back, the Master of Ceremonies announced a special guest. Murmurs rippled through the hall as General Thomas Whitaker rose from a seat in the back and walked steadily to the stage. His presence commanded the room without effort. He adjusted the microphone, then looked directly at me for a long second before turning to the audience. "Most of you know me as a commander," he said, his voice resonant and measured. "Tonight I want to speak about a man who taught me what command truly means. Not through rank or medals, but through the example of a friend." He told their story with quiet power. Not the sanitized version of battlefield heroics, but the truth of two young soldiers who had faced fire together, shared fears, and made a pact over 2 identical silver rings. He described the geometric engraving that symbolized the road home, and the promise that if one did not return, the other would watch over his family. "Daniel Grant never sought glory," General Whitaker continued. He refused honors that would have elevated his name because he believed the mission was always about bringing everyone home. He saved my life more than once, but his greatest gift was showing me that real honor lives in the promises we keep long after the guns fall silent. His eyes found mine again. "Melissa, your father never stopped thinking of you. Even in the hardest moments he carried your picture and spoke of the daughter who would one day find her own path. I am here tonight because I finally kept the last promise I made to my friend." The hall was completely still. I could hear my own heartbeat. After the applause faded and the formal program concluded, General Whitaker approached me near the side of the stage. The crowd was beginning to disperse, offering respectful nods as they passed. From his pocket he drew the silver ring that had once stopped my world in the conference room. The metal caught the light just as it had that fateful morning. He held it out to me. "This always belonged to the Grant family," he said, voice thick with emotion. "It's time it came home." I reached into my small clutch and withdrew my father's original ring, the one I had kept wrapped in his faded handkerchief for so many years. Side by side they were unmistakably a pair. The same brushed silver, the same worn edges, the same intricate pattern that no jeweler could explain. With steady hands I slipped both rings onto my right index finger. They fit perfectly together, one carrying my father's history, the other, the unbreakable promise of friendship and duty. Tears welled in my eyes, but they were not only of sorrow. For the first time, the absence I had carried since I was 9 no longer felt like a void. My father had never truly left. He lived in the honor that guided my decisions, in the promises kept across decades, in the lives he had touched and saved, and most of all in the woman I had become. General Whitaker placed a hand on my shoulder, the same steady gesture he had offered in the garden months before. "He would be so proud, Melissa." "I know," I whispered. "I feel him here." As we stood together beneath the flags, surrounded by the quiet dignity of remembrance, I understood the deepest truth of that silver ring. It was never just jewelry. It was a legacy passed not through blood alone, but through love, duty, and the quiet courage to keep going. Some legacies aren't written in history books. They're carried quietly, in promises that never die. If this story touched something in you the way a single promise can bridge decades, heal old wounds, and remind us what truly matters, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Melissa's journey resonated with you most? Have you ever discovered hidden truths about someone you loved? Drop a comment below and share where you're watching from. We have many more powerful stories like this one waiting to be told, real moments of courage, connection, and quiet strength. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss when they arrive. Let's keep honoring these legacies together, one story at a time.